Tolerate exile. For now.
Hello everyone, Cannonlowy here, and this will be my second Path of Exile build guide for the end of Delirium League, but before the Harvest League. So, this is my Hollow Palm technique character that I had showcased a little bit earlier when I was trying out the Keystone for the very first time. And if you've never heard of Hollow Palm technique, it is a very interesting keystone. It is a build that is all around dexterity stacking for flat added physical damage. But this does come with a few downsides. You have to be unencumbered in order to activate this keystone, which means you cannot wear gloves and you cannot have any weapons equipped. But if you have enough dexterity, you gain a lot of damage. And also, it has 60% more attack speed while you are unencumbered. So, with that in mind, I decided to make a Frenzy charge stacking Frenzy Raider character. So, basically, with these nodes and then the Onslaught nodes, to have a really fast playstyle with this keystone, and I feel like I have achieved that. But before I go any further, so if there's anything that you want to skip to in this build guide, I will leave timestamps either in the description or a pinned comment. So if you want to skip to the passive tree or anything like that, that is where you'll find out all of that good stuff. So, for the gear, I never got my most optimal gear, because when I started this character, it was roughly a month-ish before the league ended, and to be completely honest, starting a character that late in a league, by the time you get to the point where you would need better gear, it is really hard to justify going through the process of crafting those items in order to have the most optimized character. So keep that in mind. With most of my build guides, I have pretty much the most optimal stuff I can realistically get, but this is one of those characters that I didn't have the extra time to do that, so they're kind of placeholders in a sense. But I will go over the optimal gear once we get into the Path of Building showcase. So just dexterity on everything. So dexterity resists life on the ring. The important thing with the body armor is to get dexterity and percent dexterity. And another thing you can do is that if you have another suffix, you can also do a crafting through the veiled items to get +% of all attributes. It's only 6%, but with any attribute stacking mechanic, having that on there is also really huge. So with the body armor, if you want to go full dexterity, it is really hard to... you're not going to have any resist to that. For the belt, you can get percent increased attributes, and also any melee or physical damage percent increases are going to do massive increases to your damage because of the keystone adds all of the flat physical damage that you're going to need. So all of the percentage bonuses from this belt, for an example, the increased percent global physical damage, increases your damage much more than other builds tend to. So for boots, dexterity as well, any resist that you can get. And one thing to keep in mind for hollow palm technique is that since you do not have a weapon, you cannot do any critical hit damage. So what I mean by that is that melee skills do not inherently have a critical strike chance that it follows. Only spells do. So what melee skills do is that they take the crit chance from your weapon and then base it off of that. So if you have a really high crit chance weapon, it goes a lot further. But with hollow palm technique, since you do not have weapons, you cannot do any critical hit damage. So going on to the boots, you cannot activate tailwind or elusive modifiers on boots. They're completely useless to you with this keystone. So do keep that in mind when you're crafting boots for yourself. And honestly, I don't entirely remember exactly the optimal boots that I had in mind. Pretty much resists life that you can get movement speed and the dexterity mod, as well as I'm using the warcry key cluster jewels. So I was going to have +1 maximum endurance charges on an influence boots. So that's pretty much the only thing that I'm missing here, other than a higher life roll. And then of course resist life and dexterity. And then the same thing for the amulet. I went with Stark Anja's Head because it adds a ton of dexterity, it increases your attack speed, and also it has a really high life modifier. So that's why I chose to do that. Another thing too is that since I'm using Frenzy and using Frenzy charge stacking, increasing your damage, increased Frenzy damage per Frenzy charge is the most powerful enchantment that you get for your helmet. But of course, because it's a helmet mod, it is really difficult to actually get that. So do keep that in mind. It's not necessarily worth it. So for the boots, also get attack speed after you've killed something for the most damage output. So for the rings and the amulet, if I remember correctly, I went for, in the optimal setup, I went with increased physical damage with Warlord Influence. So with the links, my 6th link for Frenzy would be multi-strike support, awakened ancestral call, awakened melee physical damage, awakened brutality. And multi-strike support, if you can get the awakened multi-strike support, that will increase your damage by probably 15% over the normal version. But Awakened Multi-Strike is like 40 exalts minimum, and there was no way I was going to be able to afford that. And then Awakened Ancestral Call is quite expensive as well, but it's only... it's like less than 10 exalts. I mean, that is still a lot, believe me, but it's not nearly as much as Awakened Multi-Strike. Awakened melee physical damage and brutality are like, I want to say 5-ish, but Awakened melee physical damage adds Intimidate, so an extra increase there, and Awakened brutality adds the important modifier of minus 10% total physical damage reduction by your hits. Since Hollow Palm Technique doesn't use a weapon, you cannot gain the minus total physical damage against your hits from other sources. What I mean by that is that some of these melee focused nodes, like Martial Expertise for two-handed weapons, does minus the physical damage reduction. A lot of the specific weapon types, if I can find them, also have it, like Blade Dancer does it with swords, that sort of thing. It is really difficult to really stack that. So Master of Force and Awakened Brutality are some of the only the only access that I have to that modifier, and it's very important to have. And there might be one more, but I'm not quite seeing it. And then for the 6th link, I would do Impale, because honestly, with this skill hitting so fast, Impale is really powerful. So with the boots, this isn't the most ideal setup. I was going to put Ancestral Warchief and Ancestral Protector with multi-totem support and maim on this 4 link here, but I didn't quite have it set up. And then for the helmet, I have Blood Rage, Enduring Cry, Dash, and Enhanced Support. So Enhanced Support isn't really necessary. You could really fit anything in there. I think I just had it lying around, and I decided to socket it in there. It doesn't really add anything. But as you can see here, without any weapons or a glove, this is the main downside of Hollow Palm Technique. You cannot... You do not have a lot of gem sockets to deal with. And then if I didn't mention, I have Dreadbanner for the Impale effect and Impale chance. It does slightly more damage than Warbanner, as well as decreasing the accuracy of nearby enemies. But like I was saying, it is really hard to get all of the utility that you would get with a normal build with the limited number of sockets. So pretty much what you're looking at is 2 4 links and then 1 6 link for your main skill. On the offhand, I actually attempted to do something interesting with it, using Smoke Mine, Rallying Cry, Enhanced Support level 4, Efficacy, Increased Duration, and Empower. Now the whole idea with this offhand was to have as much increased duration as I could get away with, to have a 22-second Rallying Cry, and if this support had quality on it, it would be like 23 seconds, which sounds like a long time, and it kind of is. But the problem is that you can switch with the inventory open, but not when it's closed, and that doesn't really make any sense. But because of that feature, the utility of this is completely wasted here. And Smoke Mine only lasts 9 seconds. It's not really worth messing around with. So one thing that I will mention though is that in my initial thoughts of the Frenzy Hollow Palm Technique is that I was using Awakened Melee Splash, and let me tell you, there is a very significant reason why Awakened Melee Splash is as cheap as it is I think I bought this for less than 10 chaos, and the Awakened Ancestral Call is like 8 exalts. It is because Awakened Melee Splash requires you to directly hit an enemy, and then it splashes that damage from that one enemy to nearby enemies. Which that doesn't really sound like a big deal, but with Ancestral Call, what it effectively does is increase the range at which you can hit enemies in the first place. So if you wanted to have like the most clear speed, you would have Awakened Melee Splash as well as Awakened Ancestral Call, and then you can pretty much kill mobs very easily. But honestly, I just didn't really think that was necessary, and we'll compare that at the very end. And some other skills that I just did not fit in here is, of course, like I said, I wanted to use Multi-Totem with Maim, with the Ancestral Protector and Ancestral Warchief, and then also the Berserk skill, because with the Cluster Jewels I get Rage from Warcry, and that is pretty much up all the time. So, with the Cluster Jewels, this first Cluster Jewel was apparently extremely difficult to craft. Warmonger did most of the crafting for me, because, if I'm being honest, he is much better at crafting than I am. Much more willing to take risks, I guess. But this Cluster Jewel has Deep Cuts, Devastator, Martial Prowess, and 2 added jewel sockets. So this is kind of what you're looking for here, as well as having the smallest amount of passives that you can get away with to minimize the amount of travel nodes that you have. So Deep Cuts increases your chance to impale. So with all of the impale bonuses, if I had a 6-link right now, I think is 75% chance to impale. And Devastator, which is probably one of the most difficult mods to get. I think besides Deep Cuts is really hard to get as well, so having both of these at once was extremely difficult on Warmonger's end. But what Devastator does is that it gives you a 15% chance for enemies to explode, dealing 1/10 of their damage as physical damage. It's basically the effect of an explode modified chest, but it only happens 15% of the time rather than 100% of the time. And to be completely honest, this mod isn't really necessary. I mean, it does help with clearing, but it doesn't help as much as I would probably like, to be completely honest, because all of the normal enemies that are being affected by this, I can kill quite easily normally, so having the explosion is kind of just for visual effect. It doesn't help as much as I would want. So if you're going to craft one of these, I would say switch out Devastator for something else. Martial Prowess increases attack speed as well as the accuracy, which is the 2 important mods on this. The extra attack damage is just kind of icing on the cake. So with the Warcry Cluster Jewels, I went with Lead by Example and Mob Mentality to gain Rage, as well as getting an additional physical damage reduction. Basically what I was going with this is trying to get Enduring Cry and my endurance charges to gain me as much physical damage reduction as I possibly could get, because this character, while it does have a lot of layers of defense, getting physical damage reduction was definitely difficult. With everything active, I gain about like 50 to 60% physical damage reduction, and with my lower-ish life pool, that basically means that even still, if I get hit by a large hit of physical damage, then I can still quite easily get one-shotted, and that is really frustrating to have. The last 2, I have Feast of Flesh to gain Life Leech, which isn't really necessary. I think I get it from the tree. If not, I get it from Blood Rage anyway. But the important thing is the plus 10 life gained for each enemy by your attacks. And this build attacks so fast that if I'm attacking something and I take a big hit, like let's say I take 2,000 damage, with this on here and my Life Leech, I pretty much instantly gain that life back. And that is really awesome to see. So with the other one, I went with Cry Wolf because, to be completely honest, it's pretty much necessary for war cries, or at least what I'm using war cries for. So you might as well take it. And then just get another mob mentality to have 10 rage per cast, just to keep up that rage much easier, and then Hollow Palm Technique right here. Also, with the Hollow Palm Technique jewel itself, it was quite easy to get some kind of corruption on it. I got You Cannot Be Hindered. I bought this for 20 or 30 chaos, but I'm sure you could also get something like You Cannot Be Corrupted Blood Cannot Be Inflicted on You, but it might be like 1 exalt instead. I mean, hindering isn't a big deal, but it's better than having no effect on there. So that's kind of the items I was going with, because I'm not 100% sure if Path of Building quite has exactly this on there. So another important thing is that I allocated Battle Cry, because of the using war cries as instant. And even though that war cries only have a 0.25 second cast time, it just felt really awkward to stop every 3 seconds just for that little bit to activate it. So having it instant is a very big quality of life type thing. And another thing I forgot to mention was that my amulet has Mana Leech on it. If it wasn't for the Mana Leech on here, this build wouldn't really work, unless you take these 3 nodes for like Mana Drinker or something, or take 1 node for the Mana Leech here. It would be pretty much impossible to sustain your mana pool with how fast you attack. So I am level 91 here, so there are definitely nodes that would make this character much better than she is, so I was going to go for these next. So in terms of defense, before we get into Path of Building, so I gain 20% physical damage reduction with just the Warcry, and with all my flasks active I have 81% evasion, 54% physical damage reduction, as well as having with the Quartz Flask up 50% chance to dodge attacks and 40% chance to dodge spells, and also 28% chance to block. So this character is very similar in a sense to my Claw Cyclone build, that she has multiple layers of defense, and when all of those fail and you get hit by a big hit, yeah, you might get one-shotted, but it happens very infrequently. And my most optimal gear has significantly higher life than I have right now. So right now I have 3,700. With my optimal gear from Path of Building, I have around 5,000. So without further ado, let's get into the Path of Building. Alright, in Path of Building, so this is the full level 100 tree. Just like all of my other build guides, I try to make a build as if I get to level 100, even though that is very unrealistic of me, but I like to see like what is the most potential that I can get out of this idea. So like I said, I was going to go for Graceful Assault, next on my leveling for the onslaught effect. I have onslaught pretty much 100% of the time, so increasing the effect of that was quite attractive to me on the tree. And then I also was going to get, I think I have Gemini, but I was going to go for Swagger, and that increases my black chance even more. So instead of 28%, I have 34% in the planned build here. One thing that I did forget to mention is that Revelry here is very important for mana sustain. The +2 mana gained for each hit by your attacks makes it so that Mana Leech actually can work, in a sense. Because, as you can see here, my Mana Leech is around 240 per second on the ideal build. And I attack 21 times per second with all of my buffs on. Or, well, I guess, let me see here, Frenzy. I do have, why does it say that I guess I forgot to switch to, Awakened Ancestral Call? For whatever reason. Okay. But I mean, realistically, getting Awakened Multi-Strike is quite unrealistic given the price point. But if you do manage it, it adds a significant amount of damage, as you can see here. But then 21 attacks per second. So definitely with your mana cost, Revelry helps a lot with that. And then I get Vigor for the 4 endurance charges. So pretty much as soon as I was leveling, I went like here, then get these 3, and then went straight down to over here to get the Hollow Palm technique. So I got Hollow Palm at level 32 with the corruption. That's what it required to equip it, and I have to say that Hollow Palm is quite possibly some of the best leveling experience that I've had in Path of Exile. Now, the main reason for that is that since all of the bosses were significantly buffed, having huge amounts of damage early on in game made it feel, in a sense, kind of like the older days before they buffed them. And that is because I really genuinely feel that some of the bosses, especially against certain builds, are definitely overtuned. But with Hollow Palm technique anyway, you can pretty much negate all of that. I was having like 5,000 damage per second at level 32. And basically you one-shot everything besides really tanky rares and bosses. But at the same time, though, because I couldn't wear gloves or wield weapons, it was very difficult to max out my res early on, or really have any res for that matter. So pretty much the most important thing is to get utmost swiftness, and then go down here is probably the most optimal way to go. And then getting all of the frenzy charges. So pretty much going with Onslaught and Avatar of the Slaughter, this build is just like pretty much any raider, really naturally fast. Like with all of these buffs on, as you can see here, over 200% increased movement speed, as well as having even more evasion and projectiles during Onslaught. So I pretty much quite comfortably get to that plus 90% evasion while I'm actually in combat. So let's look a little bit more on the skills and stuff. So I'm using Dread Banner, Berserk, Blood Rage for the extra attack speed, and Enduring Cry, Frenzy with Awakened Brutality, Awakened Melee Physical Damage, normal multi-strike because, like I said, Awakened version is way too expensive, Ancestral Call, and Impale. And Impale by itself, as you can see here, adds like half my damage. So definitely keep that in mind. The 6 link is very important. And even with a 5 link on tooltip, I gain over 1 million DPS, or at least like 800,000. I think it kind of depends on if I have my totem out. But I can get around 1 million tooltip DPS without the impale support, so yeah. And then here, like I said, both totems, multi-totem and maim. And also a vulnerability ring is in my planned build, which I never got. Pride in an unset ring, dash in my second ring here, and then this is, I can get rid of that, rallying cry and smoke mine attempt setup there on my offhand there. And also it's a Sinvictus, so the off chance that I actually gain Rampage is quite nice as well. So, going on to the gear, of course, the helmet is the same. The body armor is get as much dexterity as you can with a hunter. Actually, I think it's Redeemer is where you get the dexterity. I'm not sure why I put it as elder or hunter item, but that's kind of what you're looking for. And then for the boots, I went with the two-toned with +1 maximum endurance charge. Is pretty much the only thing outstanding besides resist and dexterity. The amulet, I needed very high strength and dexterity. Strength especially for my strength gems, so that's where that is from. Increased percent dexterity and mana leech. Unset rings with curse vulnerability. Skills have minus mana cost, and honestly, I'm not sure if the minus mana cost is completely necessary, but it definitely does help if you have mana problems. And I forget if that craft is a prefix or suffix. If you don't need it, I'm sure you can get like extra something. And then with the leather belt, increased percent attributes. And then this is the important one. If you have a hunter item, you can have enemies have minus 15% total physical damage reduction, and with the previous two sources of that, that's minus 30%. And so basically any boss that isn't serious, you can pretty much completely negate their armor values. So that is really nice. So when you're looking at the gameplay, since I don't have this, that can make quite a big difference. So for the flasks, I have Life Flask Lion's Roar, a Jade Flask of Reflexes for a huge chunk of evasion, Basalt Flask to get as much physical damage reduction as I could, and I decided to go with a Quartz Flask. You could also go with like a Quicksilver or pretty much anything instead of a Quartz Flask if you really want, like a Bottled Faith for the percent increased damage taken would probably be really good here. But I figured that increasing the chance of dodge was worth it in the end. So that's kind of what I was going with. And then for the Pantheon, I decided to do Brian King just because I absolutely despise stun locking. And for the second one, depends on what you're doing. As you can see here, I have quite comfortably negative chaos resistance, so I pretty much instantly die from anything that deals chaos damage, as annoying as it is. So that's what I was going for. But overall, I think it turned out pretty well. And if I had the most optimal gear and everything, having the 4800 life, or at least close to that, as well as much higher damage output, this build has a lot of potential. But I cannot state the downsides enough. Having no gloves and no weapons you pretty much are required to use unset rings unless you want to give up something important like a movement skill or the ability to maim enemies with your totems to increase the damage taken even more. It just makes it so the amount of utility that you can use is very limited, and I really don't like using unset rings if I can all help it, because I would rather have a coral ring or a vermilion ring to increase my life as much as possible, especially since Path of Exile these days, you pretty much need like over 5,000 life in order to tank a big hit from any of the higher up bosses, and that is really annoying at times. And then also you can't crit. So in a sense, even though that this build is extremely powerful, and honestly this is probably the highest damage build I have ever made, I still think that especially if you have a lot of currency, you can get the same level of success through other means. And maybe, it will probably most likely take a lot more currency to get it to this point, but at the same time you won't have the downsides that this one does. So overall, that's kind of what I was looking at. And using endurance charges with the warcries I think helps a lot. In game I actually do not have capped fire res, so having the endurance charges really helps cap out the resistances. Well, besides chaos obviously. And unless you want to give up either a large chunk of damage or some utility, you can't really get any chaos resistance unless you somehow get some from the tree somewhere. I don't know. But let's get back into the game quick. Alright, back into the game. So let's look at the differences between melee splash and an awakened ancestral call. So I will say this right off the bat before I finish this here. This build, because of how fluid it feels, especially since I switched to ancestral call support, this has been one of the most enjoyable builds that I've played in quite a while. I mean, my mining character, using Stormblast Mine, well, he is good. I definitely haven't had a build to feel this fluid. So obviously I'm only in a level 67 area, and so I'm gonna be pretty much one-shotting everything. But I just kind of want to showcase like how fast this build can go and whatnot. Like the really fluid sense of killing a mob super quick like that, and then going on to the next mob with dash. It just feels so good to use. So my DPS without my flask on is like 800k tooltip, so it definitely is up there. But comparing Ancestral Call as well as Melee Splash, like look how far away I can hit stuff with this Awakened Ancestral Call. Obviously with normal Ancestral Call, it's a bit, you don't get as much range, but look how far away I can hit stuff. This doesn't feel like a melee character. Like, it feels like a mid-range, almost semi, in the ranged category of being able to do stuff. So let's switch Ancestral Call with Melee Splash. So if I can find that enemy again. So as you can see here, if I hit an enemy, sure, it'll kill what's behind it, but if it's only a normal enemy, I have to pretty much get right up in its face, and then, in order to hit it. So with Ancestral Call, that pretty much makes this build right here. Like, if I was only using if I was only using melee splash instead, this build wasn't nearly as much fun. I can tell you that much. But look how far away... It just amazes me. Like, it feels like I have both area of effect and melee range, and it just doesn't feel like a melee character. So I'm gonna state this right here. Do not do what I did and try to use melee splash with this character. Use ancestral call, alright? So, some final thoughts. So this build is, yeah, like I said, is one of the most enjoyable builds that I've played. Pretty much ever since I played Path of Exile, this has probably been the most enjoyable build that I've made. And this build was primarily inspired by Mathil's Frenzy Raider build that he made before, but I chose to use the warcry cluster duels, which, as far as I know, he decided not to do. So, in my mind, using the warcries and everything, I think it makes it... I think it goes hand in hand with this character, because having that extra 20% physical damage reduction just flat out because of the Enduring Cry feels really good. As well as having that light regen every so often, it makes it so that Blood Rage, even if I didn't have that physical damage reduction, Blood Rage wouldn't be an issue pretty much at all, and it increases your life regen even more because you're attacking more with Feast of Flesh. So I think it just turned out very well. But before I end it here, I want to make one thing pretty much saying this straight out. Hollow Palm technique, I would not be surprised if they nerfed it quite a bit after in Harvest League. Now, personally, I wouldn't want it to be nerfed, not necessarily because it's overpowered per se, but because it's so novel in the sense. It makes it so that you can pretty much play any unarmed skill with Hollow Palm technique because you have that more attack speed. Makes some of the slower skills more bearable, and also it is just a unique playstyle to wrap your brain around, not having these three item slots used. And I feel like that is a really unique gameplay, and it does have its downsides, like I keep saying. So I wouldn't be surprised if Hollow Palm technique takes a hit in Harvest League. So the damage numbers that you're looking at might be, depending on how they change it, it might be significantly less than that. And so instead of over 20 million using the most optimal gear against Sirius, you might be looking at more around 10 to 15 million, making it so that other skills might be more effective. And also, I haven't switched out Frenzy for any other skills, so if you're using a different skill, like a slam skill or physical damage conversion type thing, like with Ice Crash or Tectonic Slam, you might even get more success than I did with Frenzy. But Frenzy definitely feels really good with this setup. But with that, I think that's all. That's pretty much the build guide. So, with that, I really hope that this build is still viable in Harvest, because of how enjoyable it is. But yeah, like I said, I would not be at all surprised if they did nerf it quite substantially, especially in early game. It is quite overpowered. Damage-wise, it is overpowered, but I don't know. I there's definitely a huge part of me that I hope that they don't nerf it too bad to make it suddenly unviable. But with that, thank you very much for watching, and have a wonderful day. And if you're interested in this build, I hope it turns out well. So